The air in Fairview, Vermont, always tasted of pine and impending snow, but in the late summer of 1897, an older, heavier silence clung to the Morton estate. Elias Vance, a meticulous yet weary historian from Boston, adjusted his thick spectacles, the glass reflecting the faded grandeur of the house. He wasn't here for the architecture, though. He was here for the archives. Elias was the last living relative of the Mortons, a distant cousin tasked with liquidating the estate, and more importantly, with understanding the cryptic, chilling final wish of his great-aunt, Elara Morton, to ensure the truth of the sisters is never spoken, only preserved. The will had come with a curious condition. An old, intricately crafted dollhouse built to scale was to be the last item removed from the property. It stood now in the cavernous, dust-shrouded parlor, dwarfing a small, worn chaise lounge. The dollhouse wasn't merely a toy, it was a morbidly accurate replica of the very house they stood in, down to the tiny, hand-painted floral wallpaper. The detail was uncanny, unsettlingly precise. Every scratch on the mahogany banister, every chipped porcelain doorknob, was painstakingly reproduced. A chilling piece, isn't it, Mr. Vance? The voice belonged to Mr. Alistair Reed, the local solicitor, a man whose permanent expression seemed molded from skepticism and regret. His breath feathered in the cooler parlor air. "It is detailed," Elias conceded, running a gloved finger over the tiny, tarnished brass knocker on the replica's front door. "Are there any records of the sisters, Mr. Reed, Lillian and Beatrice Morton? My search has been strangely fruitless. No photos, no letters, barely a mention in the town ledgers beyond their birth and death notices. They seem to have been deliberately scrubbed from history." Reed shifted his weight, the floorboards groaning under the weight of history and his discomfort. The Mortons were private, reclusive even by Vermont standards. After the parents died in 75, they rarely left. They were the ladies of the house. And the town. They keep their distance from things they don't understand, Mr. Vance. And the sisters' situation was unsettling. Elias frowned. Unsettling how? Was there a scandal? Financial ruin? Just the silence. They stopped receiving guests entirely after 1880, a complete, sudden withdrawal. And then there was the fire. Reed lowered his voice, the sound a conspiratorial rasp. A small blaze in the West Wing library, quickly extinguished. But after that, the house truly closed itself off. And the dollhouse, it appeared around that time too. They say Lillian, the elder sister, obsessed over it. Elias turned back to the miniature house. Its windows were dusty, but he could just make out two small porcelain dolls sitting rigid in the parlor. Lillian, tall and severe, positioned near a tiny desk, and Beatrice, smaller, facing the wall near the window, her tiny hands seemingly clasped. He noticed a detail that made the hair on his neck prickle. The miniature fireplace in the west wing of the dollhouse had tiny, realistic char marks painted on its mantel, perfectly mirroring the discoloration he'd noticed minutes ago in the actual library. "The replica is too perfect," Elias murmured, pulling a heavy leather-bound ledger from his satchel, the first piece of archive material he'd found, a household accounting book from 1881. It's a historical document in miniature. But why would they spend years documenting their lives in this manner, only to have their actual lives erased from all public and family records? Reed merely shrugged, his eyes darting towards the door, clearly eager to leave the cold atmosphere. Perhaps they didn't want to be remembered. Some secrets, Mr. Vance, are meant to stay buried under the frozen ground of Vermont. I have done my duty. The keys are yours. Be careful with the west wing. The floor is weaker now. Elias felt the immense weight of the family legacy pressed down on him. The inheritance wasn't just money or property. It was a mystery. He was a historian, a man who lived by facts and evidence, yet the only evidence he had was a perfect, silent miniature of a house that held a secret the owners had meticulously tried to bury. He flipped through the ledger. Amidst entries for coal, tea, and dry goods, he noticed a recurring, unusual expense starting in late 1880, shortly after the fire. One does. Small, fine-gauge steel wire, followed by brass plating solution, and small tool kit, engravers. What did two secluded sisters need with industrial wire and engraving tools? The atmosphere was thick, not just with dust, but with a palpable sense of unresolved conflict. The silence of the old house was louder than any scream. Elias knew he couldn't leave. He had to delve into the replica, the physical echo of the truth, and uncover why the Morton sisters had chosen to live in a silence so profound it had followed them beyond the grave. A shadow from the tall, mullioned windows stretched long and distorted across the parlor floor, reaching the base of the dollhouse. As the cloud cover shifted, the sudden influx of light made the miniature furniture inside seem to flicker, momentarily suggesting movement within its tiny, darkened rooms. Elias took a deep, steadying breath, his hand resting on the cool, polished wood of the dollhouse exterior. This was more than a liquidation. It was an investigation into a calculated disappearance, a self-inflicted erasure. The dollhouse was the key, the sealed family diary. And he was about to break the lock. He needed to find the entry point, the first miniature clue. If you're as intrigued by the secrets of the Morton family and this chilling dollhouse as Elias is, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter of this unfolding mystery. The following morning, the Vermont frost had retreated, leaving a crisp, clear day, yet the air inside the Morton house remained heavy. Elias had spent the night in the small, relatively modern annex attached to the kitchen, unable to bring himself to sleep in the main house. His historian's instinct was at war with a profound sense of unease. His attention was fixated entirely on the dollhouse. He had taken precise measurements, confirming it was an exact 1/12 scale replica, a feat of craftsmanship bordering on obsession. He was looking for the discrepancy, the tiny error, the misplaced item, the detail that would betray the sisters' hidden reality. The first thing he did was compare the tiny dolls to the sparse descriptions he had. Lillian, the elder, was rigid, staring forward with an expressionless fixed gaze. Beatrice, positioned near the window, was slightly hunched, facing away towards the wall. This placement seemed deliberate, almost symbolic. Elias began his systematic examination room by room, starting with the miniature parlor. He noted the tiny desk where the Lillian doll sat. He carefully opened the hinged roof of the dollhouse, allowing light into the attic space. Nothing but dust and miniature rafters. He moved down to the second floor, examining the two small bedrooms, which were identical in layout. In the smaller room, which he assumed belonged to Beatrice, the miniature bedsheets were rumpled, suggesting restless sleep. In the larger room, Lillian's, the sheets were immaculately flat, almost unnaturally so. His focus then shifted to the west wing, the site of the actual fire. The miniature library was a masterpiece of tiny detail, tiny books lining the shelves, a miniature globe, and the aforementioned charred mantelpiece. As he gently tried to open the miniature door to the library, he felt a slight resistance. It didn't budge. He tried the parlor door and the kitchen door. They opened smoothly. Only the library door was sealed. This was the discrepancy. In a house where every other detail was functional, why was the door to the site of the fire sealed? Using a jeweler's loupe, he examined the tiny crack between the door and the frame. He noticed the minute presence of wax, meticulously applied. The sisters hadn't merely closed the door, they had sealed it. Elias decided to investigate the actual West Wing library. Armed with a kerosene lamp, he ascended the main staircase. The hallway was cold, the air thin. When he reached the library, the scent of old smoke and decay was immediate and strong. The room was structurally intact, but the damage from the fire was undeniable. Soot stains marred the ceiling. and the mantelpiece indeed showed the same charring as the miniature. He moved to the large built-in mahogany bookcase. According to the original house plans he'd found in Reed's office, this room was supposed to have a second door leading to a small service staircase, but it wasn't there. The space was filled entirely by the immense, immovable bookcase, now stuffed with damp, mildewed volumes. He ran his hand across the rear panel of the case. It felt solid. He returned to the dollhouse, his pulse quickening. He looked at the miniature library again, focusing on the bookcase. With a pair of fine tweezers, he carefully removed the tiny books from the miniature shelf. Underneath, he saw a minute seam, a hair's breadth opening in the paneling of the miniature bookcase. He probed it gently with a needle. Click. The miniature bookcase swung open on tiny hinges, revealing a dark, hidden compartment. Inside the tiny space lay a rolled-up piece of parchment, no bigger than a child's little finger, tied with a thread of the same fine-gauge steel wire mentioned in the ledger. Elias carefully extracted it. Unfurling the minuscule scroll under the light of the parlor window, he could barely make out the elegant, cramped script written in charcoal. It was an entry, dated October 14th, 1880. L insists on the finality. The room is sealed. Our world must now exist only within the glass walls. Beatrice weeps, but I have promised her it is for the best. The architect's secret is now ours alone to bear. The truth is too heavy for the world outside. The key is in the place where only the eye can see. Elias felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. L was surely Lillian. The room is sealed. Not just the miniature door, but the actual room. And the architect's secret. This was more than a domestic tragedy. It was a conspiracy of silence, meticulously crafted by the sisters themselves. He looked up at the library door again, then back to the miniature. The key is in the place where only the eye can see. He realized the significance of the tiny, perfect replica. It was the map, the key, the confession. He needed to find the actual architect's secret, the hidden service stairwell or chamber in the real library. But first, he needed to understand what was so horrific that it necessitated the complete erasure of their lives and the sealing of a room. The wire, the engraving tools, the sealed door, it all pointed to an act of imprisonment or confinement. But who or what was confined? Elias spent the afternoon searching the real library, meticulously tapping every section of the wall around the immense bookcase. The room was structurally sound, except for the weak flooring Mr. Reed had warned him about, which sagged slightly near the fireplace. The architect's secret, however, remained hidden. The masonry behind the bookcase was solid, impenetrable. Frustrated, he returned to the dollhouse, understanding that the clue he needed was not in the physical house yet, but in the miniature narrative. He focused on the second item in the sisters' ledger, the engraving tools and brass plating solution. This suggested they weren't just building a replica. They were creating metadata, tiny labels or marks to record something specific. He revisited the dolls. Lillian was sitting at the desk. He carefully used his tweezers to lift the tiny hands of the porcelain doll. Engraved on the back of the doll's right wrist, visible only under his loupe, was the number 7. He repeated the process for Beatrice. On her left ankle, equally concealed, was the number 12. 7 and 12. What do they represent? Elias then turned his attention to the miniature house's furnishings, checking for any signs of engraving. The miniature dining room was sparsely furnished. He examined the tiny chairs around the table, counting them. There were 4, the standard number for the 2 sisters and their deceased parents. He picked up one of the miniature china plates. On the underside, where it would never be seen unless intentionally lifted, was a tiny, precisely etched Roman numeral, I. He checked the other 3 plates, 2, 3, and IV. He realized the sinister pattern. The sisters were cataloging items of loss or significance with numbers hidden from casual view. Elias began a systematic inventory of loss in the miniature house, documenting the hidden numbers. 1. Dining room plates. I-2, 3, I-4. 4 plates, suggesting 4 family members. Normal. 2. Lillian's wrist. 7. Unclear. 3. Beatrice's ankle. 12. Unclear. 4. The miniature grandfather clock. Elias found this in the main hall. He opened the tiny wooden door and peered inside. The pendulum was missing. Etched into the brass base of the clock face was the number 1878. 5. The miniature picture frame. In Lillian's bedroom, there was a tiny empty frame on the nightstand. Etched into the back of the frame, concealed against the wall, was the word Martha. The number 1878 coincided with a period of severe illness documented in a brief family history he'd found. A flu epidemic that had swept through Fairview. But who was Martha, and what did the numbers 7 and 12 signify? Elias went back to his ledger. He flipped to the year 1878. Under M Supplies, there were entries for Dr. Holloway's visits, followed by burial plot fee. The entries continued for several months before stopping entirely. Martha was almost certainly a third sister, erased entirely from all family records, perhaps a younger one who died in the epidemic. Her picture was removed, her name only preserved in the empty frame. This established the sisters' pattern of archival erasure. The numbers 7 and 12, however, were still a mystery. Elias theorized they must refer to time or measurement. He went back to the clock. 1878. A loss. The pendulum, the element that measures time, was missing. He examined the Lillian doll with the 7 on her wrist. Lillian was the dominant, controlling sister, according to the town's sparse memory. He looked at the real house's calendar hanging in the kitchen, dated for the day of his arrival, Friday, September 24th, 1897. He counted the distance between the 2 windows in the parlor of the real house. It measured approximately 7 feet. He checked the wall where Beatrice's doll was facing. The distance from the center of the Beatrice doll's position to the wall was exactly 12 inches in the actual house. 7 feet and 12 inches. Elias felt a sickening lurch. The numbers weren't dates or generic codes, they were precise measurements, locations. Lillian was marking a distance of 7 feet and Beatrice 12 inches. He immediately went back to the library. The bookcase was roughly 7 feet wide. He measured 7 feet from the fireplace mantel, the charred symbolic point, straight towards the bookcase. The point landed precisely in the middle of the unmoving bookcase. This must be the location of the architect's secret, the concealed door. He then looked for the 12 inches. Beatrice's position was facing the wall, 12 inches away from the wall in the library. He found a small, low-standing wooden chest, a kind of wood box for kindling, pushed exactly 12 inches from the wall, near the sagging floorboards. He knelt down, testing the pressure on the boards near the chest. They gave slightly. The numbers were a coded instruction, a clue hidden in a spatial map. Lillian's 7 marked the location behind the bookcase. Beatrice's 12 marked the trigger or the weakness in the floor near the wall. The 2 sisters, one dominant, one subservient, had left behind 2 halves of a secret to unlock the truth. The tension in the house escalated from mere mystery to a frightening sense of engineered control. He was being guided by the dead. The realization that the dollhouse was a precise, coded map energized Elias, despite the growing psychological terror. He knew the bookcase was the objective, but he couldn't move it alone. He needed to focus on the other secrets held within the sealed room. He returned to the tiny rolled-up parchment found in the miniature library. The entry had ended. The key is in the place where only the eye can see. Elias understood the eye to mean observation or perspective. He went back to the dollhouse parlor and re-examined the Beatrice doll. the smaller sister marked with the 12 measurement. She was still sitting, hunched, facing the wall. He picked up the dollhouse and turned it to face the light, then gently removed the Beatrice doll from her seat. Under the light, he saw that the wall she had been facing was not plain. It was the only wall in the parlor that had a miniature mirror, a tiny silvered square of glass. He held the Beatrice doll up to the mirror. The doll was perfectly reflected. But as he adjusted the angle, a faint, almost invisible mark on the wooden wall just above the mirror caught his attention. It was a shallow scratch, placed exactly where the doll's porcelain head would have obscured it if she were sitting normally. Elias carefully felt the scratch with his fingernail. It wasn't a random mark. It was an engraved initial, a simple, elegant B. Suddenly, he saw it. The dollhouse itself, being a perfect 1/12 replica, was an analogy. The sisters hadn't kept a paper diary. The dollhouse was the diary, its configuration, its marks, its sealed rooms, all documenting the events of their isolation. He placed the Beatrice doll back, but this time he moved her position slightly to the side to reveal the tiny B scratch. He then noticed that the miniature wall itself, where the mirror and the B were located, seemed to have a faint border. He applied pressure. Click. The wall panel, no bigger than his thumb, swung inward on miniature hinges, revealing a secret compartment behind the parlor. This time the compartment was completely empty, save for a small layer of dust and a single, withered yellow flower. Elias paused, his heart pounding. Why an empty compartment, and why the single flower? He thought back to the family history, Lillian and Beatrice, the two sisters. The house had 4 original occupants. The parents died in 75. Martha died in 78. That left the 2 sisters. Yet the house felt like it held 3 presences. He returned to the main house and went to the kitchen. He found an old tin of dried herbs and spices. Amidst the dusty contents, he located a small, wilted sprig that matched the miniature flower, yellow leucostrife, a flower known in the Victorian era to symbolize secret separation or silent grief. The sisters weren't just erasing records, they were documenting a separation. He went back to the dollhouse, his gaze fixed on the Beatrice doll. The empty compartment felt like a clue about absence. The B was on the wall behind the doll, the silent sister. He considered the possibility of a third doll. He had only ever seen Lillian and Beatrice. If Martha was represented by the empty frame, perhaps the secret compartment symbolized a third person who had been removed or separated after 1880, but wasn't dead. He began to search the entire house for a third doll, a miniature figure that would complete the terrifying trinity of secrets. The dead sister, Martha, the empty frame, the dominant sister, Lillian, the 7 measurement, and the silent separated person. The empty compartment, the yellow leucostrife. He found it in the only place he hadn't yet searched. The basement. Tucked inside a discarded sewing basket, under layers of dusty fabric, was a third porcelain doll, crudely made, unlike the fine workmanship of the other 2. It had coarse, dark hair painted on and wore a simple grey dress. It looked less like a lady and more like a servant. The doll's eyes were painted wide in a look of permanent terror. On the bottom of its foot, etched deeply, was the word, Ilara. Elias froze. Ilara, his great-aunt, the woman who had left him the will, the house, and the cryptic instruction to preserve the truth of the sisters. Ilara, the third sister, was not dead. She was missing from all records, represented by an empty space, a silent flower, and a crudely made doll hidden in the basement. The horror intensified. Ilara hadn't left the house. She had been confined or erased by her sisters. Her last will was not a final instruction, but a desperate, delayed plea for help. A final attempt to use the historian in the family to find the truth she couldn't speak. The architect's secret in the library was not a safe. It was a prison. The discovery of the Elara doll and its chilling significance cemented Elias's belief. The Morton house held a terrible secret of familial imprisonment, orchestrated by Lillian and Beatrice. The next step had to be the library. He decided to seek help. The weight of the secret and the physical effort of moving a 7-foot-wide mahogany bookcase was too much for one man. He drove his rented buggy into Fairview Village. The town was a picturesque cluster of Victorian homes, but the atmosphere was anything but welcoming. The locals, bundled against the crisp autumn air, seemed to stop talking the moment he approached. Elias walked into the general store, the only place he felt he might find a strong, discreet man for hire. The proprietor, a stout man named Mr. Hadley, barely looked up from weighing flour. "Good day, I'm Elias Vance, staying up at the Morton estate," Elias began, adopting a formal, business-like tone. Hadley's hands paused. The few customers in the store shifted uncomfortably. "Know who you are, Mr. Vance?" "The historian." The word was pronounced with a heavy dose of skepticism. "I need to hire a couple of men, strong, trustworthy. There's a large antique bookcase in the library I need moved to examine the wall behind it. It's part of the estate evaluation." Hadley finally looked up, his face hardening. "The Morton place? Nobody goes up there, Mr. Vance. Not for work, not for anything." "I'll pay 3 times the going rate," Elias pressed. "Discretion guaranteed." Hadley leaned in, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "It ain't about the money, son. It's about them sisters. After the fire, after they sealed themselves in, things got strange. You see, the Mortons had a companion living with them, a young woman, not kin, not exactly a servant either. Just there. They called her Miss E." Elias felt a chill. Miss E. Elara. "She disappeared," Hadley continued, watching Elias's face closely. "Simply vanished. Lillian and Beatrice told the local constable she took ill and was sent to relatives in the city. But the carriage never went to the city. It came back empty. And the town believed this? No, Mr. Vance. They accepted it. They had to. The Mortons had influence, but we all knew. That house closed itself and the woman was gone. We knew the sisters were strange, kept her locked up even before she vanished. The townspeople, they decided to let the whole thing suffocate in silence. No one wanted to cross Lillian Morton. She had a way of looking at you, like she saw a secret you didn't know you had. Elias understood now. The sisters hadn't just erased Elara. They had terrorized the town into complicity. The calculated ostracism was the town's defense mechanism, a collective act of willful ignorance to avoid danger and scandal. "Did anyone ever see Miss E after 1880? Elias asked. Hadley wrung his hands on his apron. "Just once. Mrs. Petrie, the postmistress, said she saw a hand, frail and white, pressed against the high, narrow window in the west wing, in the room next to the library. Not the library itself, but the small storage room beside it. That was 1882. After that, nothing, and Mrs. Petrie started drinking heavily. The storage room next to the library, not the architect's secret behind the bookcase, but the smaller room beside it." Elias suddenly remembered a detail from the blueprints. A narrow, disused utility shaft running from the storage room down to the kitchen annex where he was sleeping. He was back to square one with the bookcase, but he now had a potential location for where Elara was actually kept, and a better understanding of the profound psychological pressure the sisters exerted. He couldn't trust anyone in Fairview. He was alone with the silent, watchful house and its deadly replica. He would have to move the bookcase himself, piece by piece, or find another way into the sealed space. As Elias left the store, he heard a woman hiss to her companion, "He's stirring up old dirt. That house should just be burned down, secrets and all." The terror was real, not supernatural, rooted in human cruelty and societal fear. The town wasn't protecting the Mortons, they were protecting their own peace. A sudden early snowfall descended upon Fairview, turning the already isolated landscape into a vast, silent wilderness. The heavy, clinging white blanket over the Morton estate intensified the isolation. The house was completely cut off. Elias had retreated to the annex, the cold of the main house now profound, forcing him to keep the small stove stoked constantly. He was reviewing his notes, the reality of Ilara's probable fate, starvation, cruelty, making his historian's heart race. He realized he was rapidly running out of time and resources. The cold was seeping into the structure, and the town would soon be impassable. He had to find a way to access the sealed room before his own mission was frozen into inaction. He returned to the Dollhouse, now armed with the horrific knowledge of Ilara's capture and the town's calculated silent complicity. He focused intensely on the library section again, specifically the tiny sealed door. If the massive bookcase could not be moved, and the effort required was clearly beyond one man working against the clock, perhaps there was another key hidden in the miniature representation. He picked up the miniature Lillian doll, 7 on the wrist, the architect of the entire control mechanism. He noticed that the tiny, meticulously rendered keys hanging from the desk where the Lillian doll sat weren't actually brass. They were made of plated steel wire, the same fine-gauge wire mentioned repeatedly in the expenditure ledger. The wire was the physical manifestation of Lillian's obsession. Elias carefully examined the bunch of tiny keys under his lamp. There were 3. The 2 larger keys were plain, simple loops. The third, smallest key had a minute, deliberate knot in its wire loop. He used his powerful jeweler's loupe to inspect it. The knot was precise, almost ceremonial. It was a coded mark, intended to differentiate it from the others. He realized the sisters didn't just buy the wire. They used it to create small tools, perhaps for rudimentary lock-picking or, more likely, for crafting false keys. Objects that looked functional but were merely part of the cipher. The key with the knot must correspond to the mechanism for the sealed library space. But the tiny key couldn't unlock the actual life-sized iron door. It was an instruction, a lead in a deadly scavenger hunt. Elias theorized that the key marked by the knot represented a key in the real house that was similar in appearance, but served a very different, unexpected function. He searched the desks, cabinets and hooks in the main house for a set of 3 antique keys. In the master bedroom, which had belonged to Lillian, he found a brass key ring hanging on a hook, holding 3 similar-looking antique iron keys. 2 were clearly labeled with small, brittle paper tags, front gate and coal cellar. The third key, identical in size and age to the others, was completely unmarked. He checked its heavy iron loop. It had a tiny worn scratch in the metal, the real-world equivalent of the miniature wire knot. He rushed to the library door, his heart hammering with a terrifying mixture of hope and dread, and tried the unmarked key. It was a perfect fit for the keyhole, but when he turned it, it only grated uselessly. Frustration. Failure. The sisters had accounted for the possibility of the key being found. He paced the parlor floor, agitated, the cold seeping through his boots. The dollhouse is a coded map, but the code relies on understanding Lillian's psychological warfare. The sisters were masters of misdirection. Why would they lead him to a key that didn't work on the door it was meant to open? He returned to the library, the useless key still clenched in his hand, and noticed again the slight sagging in the floor near the chest, the spot marked by Beatrice's 12 measurement. He knelt and applied pressure to the area. The floorboard groaned loudly, confirming the structural weakness Mr. Reed had mentioned. He then looked at the key in his hand. If it didn't open a door, what else could an old, square-headed iron key unlock? His gaze fell upon the heavy iron fire poker resting by the charred fireplace. It was solid, utilitarian, and made of the same dark metal as the key. He held the key up to the poker. The key's head was a thick, ridged square, not designed for a typical tumbler lock, but perhaps designed to fit into a socket or act as a lever. Elias pressed the small key against the sagging floorboard near the 12-inch mark. He felt a small, circular indentation in the wood that he hadn't noticed before, camouflaged by a decade of dust and age. The unmarked key slid perfectly into the indentation, becoming a makeshift handle. He gave it a slow, deliberate turn, using the key as a T-handle. A loud, grinding metallic sound echoed through the room, vast and unnerving in the sudden quiet of the snowstorm. The air suddenly smelled metallic and stale, like aged iron and trapped air. The immense bookcase, which he had believed to be a solid, immovable barrier, did not open. Instead, a section of the wall behind the space where the bookcase stood, near the ceiling, retracted with a heavy, scraping thud, revealing a dark, narrow shaft. This was the architect's secret, a ventilation or communication shaft leading directly into the sealed room, designed not for ventilation, but to allow Lillian to monitor and control the prisoner without being seen or heard by the outside world. It was a surveillance port. The space was too small and narrow to climb through, but it was enough to see. Elias grabbed his lamp and held it up to the opening, illuminating the pit below. The shaft led down into a small, cold, windowless chamber. The light revealed the grim reality. 1. A rusted, bolted iron door on the far side, the actual entrance to the sealed room, concealed entirely behind the bookcase. 2. A narrow wooden bunk, covered with thin, threadbare blankets, clearly meant for long-term use. 3. A small, chained bucket in the corner serving as a toilet. 4. And most chillingly, a series of tiny hand-drawn pictures of the Morton house, tacked crudely to the stone wall, drawn with charcoal. Ilara had been here, for years, and she had been driven to draw her prison, a crude, silent record of her confinement, a desperate artistic output in the face of psychological annihilation. Elias had found the truth of the sisters' cruelty, confirmed with sickening physical evidence, but Ilara was gone. The room was empty. He looked through the opening again. On the floor, near the bunk, was one final, heartbreaking discovery. A single, crude toy, fashioned entirely from twisted, fine-gauge steel wire. A miniature, stick-figure doll. Ilara's final, desperate attempt at companionship, created with the very wire her sister used to document and enforce her imprisonment. The discovery of the crude wire doll, the surveillance shaft, and Ilara's desolate sketches shifted Elias's perspective entirely. The archaeological investigation had become a frantic rescue mission, even though the rational historian knew Ilara was long gone. The question was no longer simply where she was, but how she was removed, and more urgently, what happened to her captors, Lillian and Beatrice. He needed to get into that sealed room now. Knowing the actual iron door and its locking mechanism were now exposed, Elias went to the woodshed. He found a heavy crowbar, a simple but necessary instrument. Slowly, brutally, and with a terrible feeling of desecration, he began to dismantle the large antique bookcase. It was a monumental, agonizing effort. It took hours of leveraging and tearing, his muscles screaming under the strain, while the snow outside piled up, muffling all sound into a smothering silence. By late afternoon, the magnificent, oppressive mahogany bookcase was in splintered pieces on the floor, revealing the full, rusted iron door, the true hidden entrance to the storage room next to the library. The door was secured by a series of 4 heavy industrial bolts, not a traditional lock. These bolts were not intended to keep a person in, but to keep the room permanently sealed from the outside world. The intent was clear. The room was a secret, to be hidden forever. He returned to the dollhouse, focusing intently on the recurrent ledger entry. 1 dose small, fine-gauge steel wire. The wire was used for Lillian's keys, Ilara's doll, and now, he theorized, for the bolts themselves, either as a mechanism or a tool to operate them. He examined the Dollhouse library again, looking closely at the miniature bolts on the tiny replica of the iron door. He noticed the minute heads of the bolts in the miniature were not perfectly round. They had been filed down to fit a non-standard wrench or key head, a unique signature of their maker. He rushed back to the main house kitchen annex, thinking, where else would the sisters keep their specialized illegal tools? In the small, bricked-up chimney cavity he'd noticed earlier, he found the engraver's toolkit and the brass plating solution he'd read about in the ledger. Alongside them was a rusted vise and a heavy-duty steel rod, filed on one end to create a makeshift, non-standard wrench head. It was the perfect chilling match for the filed heads of the bolts on the iron door. It became chillingly clear. The sisters didn't buy a lock for the room. They used their industrial supplies to engineer their own prison and the unique tools to operate it, ensuring that no conventional key, no town official, no police constable could ever open it without destroying the house. The wire wasn't just for crafting, it was the raw material for their tyranny, the means of their complete control. Elias inserted the makeshift wrench into the top bolt head. It fit perfectly, confirming his deduction. With a groan of old, cold metal, the bolt began to turn. One by one, he loosened the 4 heavy bolts. The moment the final bolt was free, the door shifted inward. The smell of stale, trapped air, dust, and something indescribably organic and decaying rushed out, assaulting his senses. The room was tiny, damp, and overwhelmingly cold. Ilara's charcoal sketches were still tacked to the wall, a desperate gallery of her decade of suffering. The narrow window, high up and useless, was caked in dust, confirming Mrs. Petrie's decades-old sighting. The wire doll lay abandoned on the bunk. On the stone floor, near the rusted chained bucket, Elias found a single, heavy, leather-bound book. The only item in the room that wasn't a utility item. It was a journal of observations, written in a shaky but defiant hand. The script was definitively Ilara's. The journal detailed her life from 1880 to 1890, the entire decade of her confinement, explaining the motives and methods of her sister's psychological campaign. The fire. It wasn't an accident. Lillian, enraged by Ilara's engagement to a local doctor, a violation of Lillian's fanatical desire for isolation and control over the family unit, deliberately set a small, contained fire in the library to destroy the engagement letters and trap Ilara, who was sleeping in the adjacent storage room while recovering from an illness. Lillian told the authorities the fire was accidental and sealed the room thereafter. The prison. Lillian saw the utility shaft and the solid stone walls of the old house as a means to total control. She systematically manipulated Beatrice, convincing her that Ilara was mentally unstable and needed seclusion for her own good, threatening to reveal a minor childhood secret of Beatrice's if she resisted. Beatrice, weak and fearful, became Lillian's terrified accomplice. The Dollhouse. Ilara wrote that the only interaction she had with the outside world was the sound of Lillian working in the library, measuring, engraving, and assembling the miniature replica. Lillian would occasionally slide a small mocking note through the shaft, detailing the latest addition to the Dollhouse, a perverse psychological game designed to remind Ilara that her life was now confined to a static, miniature representation, and that Lillian was the sole, omnipotent curator of her reality. The final entry, dated September 14, 1890, was scrawled with a raw, desperate intensity, the script almost tearing through the paper. Lillian is changing the clock today. She says she is stopping the time of my punishment in the miniature world. She is bringing Beatrice with her. I hear them now, arguing, the voices high and sharp in the library above. Beatrice sounds terrified. She keeps asking Lillian to stop, to just let her out, now that Papa is gone and there is no one to judge. Lillian's voice is cold, like ice over stone. She says, "No, you are my witness, Beatrice. You will never betray me. The dollhouse must remain perfect, a symbol of our solitude. But there is a new sound, a heavy, dragging sound from the hall, muffled and sickening. I smell the old, leaking gas lamp from the hallway. I hear a terrible, sickening crack. My God, what has she done to Beatrice? Or what has Beatrice done to her? The sound is gone. Silence again. But the air is heavy with finality. The journal ended there. Ilara hadn't been removed from the house. Her decade-long confinement had been a prelude to something far darker and more violent. And Beatrice, the silent accomplice, was now clearly a central figure in a sudden, desperate, fatal confrontation. The mystery had deepened into a dual murder. Ilara's journal tore through Elias's historical detachment, revealing the true, sickening nature of Lillian's psychological dominance. The older sister hadn't just confined Ilara. She had curated her suffering by meticulously building the dollhouse as a static, beautiful symbol of her sister's loss of freedom and the total control exerted over her fate. But the final entry, detailing Lillian's heated confrontation with Beatrice and the terrifying, dragging sound, pointed to a final, fatal act in September 1890, 4 full years before the official death dates listed for both sisters in the town's sparse records. The chronology was a lie. The official narrative was a cover-up. Elias needed to find the ultimate, conclusive entry in the Dollhouse diary, the final, devastating configuration that documented the events of that murderous night in 1890. He raced back to the parlor, his boots thudding heavily on the dusty floorboards. The dollhouse stood silent and unchanged, an elegant miniature tomb, but Elias looked at it with new, horrified eyes. He was no longer examining a curio, he was reading a crime scene report. His gaze snapped to the miniature grandfather clock in the hall, etched with 1878, the year of Martha's death, and missing its pendulum. Lillian, on September 14, 1890, had explicitly declared she had stopped the time of Ilara's punishment in the miniature world. He picked up the clock again, his hands trembling slightly as he felt the cold brass. The front of the miniature clock face was still a static decorative plate, permanently set to 3 o'clock. But the back, which was pressed against the parlor wall, had another subtle detail. Using the tip of his small, antique pocket knife, Elias carefully pried the miniature clock away from the wall. Behind it, carved deeply into the exposed wood of the wall, were the decisive numerals 9:14:90, September 14th, 1890. The clock wasn't stopping time. It was marking the moment of the collapse. Next, he examined the dolls of Lillian and Beatrice, meticulously observing their placement and condition with his powerful loupe. The Lillian doll was still sitting rigidly at the tiny mahogany desk, the architect of the entire twisted scenario. Elias ran his gloved finger along the back of the doll's neck. He felt a minute, hairline crack in the porcelain, so fine it was expertly concealed by a dab of carefully matched ivory paint. The crack wasn't a flaw, it was a wound. It followed a distinct line from the base of the skull up the back of the head, indicative of a sudden catastrophic force. The Beatrice doll was still facing the wall, the submissive sister. Elias noticed for the first time that Beatrice was positioned closer to the wall than seemed natural for a seated figure, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. He gently turned her to face him. Her expression was the same, a mask of frozen fear. He examined the tiny dress, a beautiful but faded grey satin. The white lace cuff on the left sleeve was noticeably stained, a faint brownish red that spoke of dried blood. The final pieces of the puzzle clicked into a terrifying mosaic. Lillian's crack. The blunt trauma on the back of Lillian's head strongly suggested she was the first to die, likely struck during the desperate final argument Ilara overheard. It was the lethal consequence of Beatrice's breaking point, an act of self-defense, or perhaps a moment of frantic rage from a woman pushed beyond endurance. Beatrice's stain and position. The stain on Beatrice's cuff implied her direct physical involvement in the immediate aftermath, handling her sister's body. Her unnatural position, pressed against the wall, was a permanent, miniature record of her psychological state, paralyzed by fear and guilt, turning her back on the consequences of her actions. But the question remained, where were their bodies? And why had the town believed they both died peacefully 4 years later, in 1894? The erasure was absolute. Elias then turned the dollhouse around to look at the rear exterior. The back of the house was entirely plain, just painted wood, carefully finished. But on the back of the parlor section, where the confrontation had taken place, he noticed a deliberate irregularity. A tiny square ventilation grate, no bigger than a thumbnail, was set low down, near the miniature foundation. This vent did not, in fact, exist on the real house's exterior. It was a miniature architectural secret. He tried to open the vent with a fine needle. It was firmly jammed. Using his jeweler's tweezers, he applied pressure until the tiny grate sprang open with a whisper of dry dust. Inside the miniature space, he saw what appeared to be tiny pieces of fabric and stiffened porcelain, small, dried and stiff scraps of material. He carefully removed the tiny fragments. They were unmistakably pieces of porcelain doll dresses, identical in pattern and fabric to the ones worn by Lillian and Beatrice. But these were not merely torn. They were shredded, as if they had been put through some kind of mechanical grinding process. Elias's mind raced back to the ledger, the fine-gauge steel wire, and the engraver's toolkit. The sisters hadn't just built a dollhouse. They had possessed the technical expertise to construct or modify something far more sinister. He felt a sickening, cold realization. They had built a miniature crematorium, or crusher, a method of complete physical annihilation. He put the pieces together. The awful final truth was exposed. After killing Lillian, Beatrice, driven to a profound state of psychosis and terrified of the shame and exposure of murder, didn't release the imprisoned Ilara. Instead, she completed Lillian's final, perverse mission: to stop time and preserve the secret by destroying the physical evidence of their lives. Beatrice had used the house's deep isolation and the industrial tools they possessed to dismember and dispose of her sister's body, most likely feeding the remains into the massive coal-burning furnace in the basement. The final, brutal and effective erasure. She then lived alone in the decaying house for 4 solitary years, posing as both sisters to the outside world and maintaining the terrifying silent illusion of the dollhouse until her own death. The shredded doll pieces in the secret vent were the tiny physical tokens of the complete, final human crime. The emotional weight of the narrative, Lillian's cold, calculated murder, Beatrice's subsequent 4 years of lonely, terrified deception, and Ilara's decade of slow, silent confinement nearly buckled Elias. He was standing in the archive of a perfect, horrifying family annihilation. He had the psychological map. Now he needed the physical mechanism. He needed to find the actual, life-sized version of the final repository, the place where the true story was locked away. He knew the sisters had an industrial-sized coal furnace in the basement, mentioned frequently in the ledger as the primary utility expense. This furnace was massive and powerful, exactly the kind of instrument that could dispose of evidence in a remote, freezing Vermont climate. He grabbed the largest kerosene lamp, its light struggling against the oppressive shadows, and descended into the cold stone cellar, the damp air thick with the smell of coal and decay. The basement was a warren of stone storage rooms and dark corners. The enormous black furnace dominated the main space, a behemoth of riveted iron and soot. He examined the main fire chamber door, secured by a heavy traditional lock. This lock wasn't the secret. It was too common. He searched the nearby coal storage bin for the final repository clue. There, half hidden beneath a pile of dry kindling, he found a small reinforced metal box, rusted but clearly of more modern construction than the rest of the cellar equipment. It was a serious lockbox, secured by a simple dial lock designed to prevent access until a certain time had passed or a specific code was entered. He remembered the final, crucial numbers he hadn't fully accounted for, the number 7 on Lillian's wrist, marking 7 feet from the fireplace, and the number 12 on Beatrice's ankle, marking the 12-inch trigger. Lillian and Beatrice, even in death, were still locked in a struggle over the final truth, each leaving a half-clue. Elias hypothesized that the lockbox combination was a psychological cipher based on their antagonistic relationship and the date of their crime. Lillian's 7, representing her rigid dominance, and Beatrice's 12, representing her confinement. He tried the literal combination 7-12, nothing. He tried 12-7, nothing. He tried the date of Ilara's confinement, 1880, nothing. He returned to the wire, the great physical and psychological weapon. He looked at the lockbox dial. It had a small glass-covered window showing the time remaining until the next opening. But the window was dark. It was indeed a time lock, set to a specific future date, or triggered by a remote mechanism. Frustrated, Elias realized he was overlooking the simplest, yet most guarded clue, the one Beatrice would leave for herself. He returned to the dollhouse for the last time. He focused on the only thing left. The Beatrice doll. The final, fearful victim. He noticed that the tiny, crude wire doll made by Ilara, which he had placed on the parlor desk, had been knocked over by a slight tremor he hadn't noticed. The tiny stick-figure doll was now pointing towards the miniature kitchen. He rushed to the miniature kitchen. The sink had a tiny working hand pump for water. He turned the pump. Nothing. The pump is the mechanism of retrieval. He suddenly understood. The kitchen sink in the real house. The utility shaft from Ilara's prison room ran down to the kitchen annex, allowing Lillian to pass small items and food to her prisoner. He raced back upstairs, his mind racing. He examined the large porcelain sink in the annex. It was a newer model for the house, installed around the 1880s. He felt under the rim of the sink basin. There, concealed by the curve of the basin and polished to look like a shadow, he found a thin brass plate screwed into the underside of the sink. The plate was brass, perfectly polished, and exquisitely engraved with a single elegant word: Beatrice. This was the key, not a physical key but a name. Beatrice had left her own final desperate clue, a secret countermeasure to Lillian's dominance, placed on the utility line that represented both her guilt and her eventual freedom. Elias ran his cold fingers over the name. He pressed firmly on the B. Click. A small hidden compartment on the side of the annex wall, cleverly disguised as a non-functional towel cupboard, sprang open. Inside, nestled on a bed of dry linen, lay a single, final yellowed page of paper. It was a confession, signed in a hurried, yet legible hand by Beatrice Morton, dated October 10th, 1894, the very day before her official date of death. It stated clearly, "I killed Lillian on September 14th, 1890, to free myself from her tyranny, but I could not free Ilara. I was too afraid to open the iron door. I let my sister starve in the dark, and I lived with her silence for 4 years, maintaining the fiction that we were both alive. When I die, the truth must be known. I altered the date on the death certificates to give myself time to prepare this archive. The key to the furnace chamber lock is in the pocket of Ilara's wedding dress in the 3rd-floor trunk. Burn the house down, but first, you must free Ilara's soul from its silence. The combination to the time lock is the date of the crime, in reverse order of the numbers Lillian used to mock our lives. The final combination was the date of the crime, but arranged to break Lillian's cipher, 7-12-90. The true abyssal horror of the Morton sisters' tragedy lay bare. Lillian's murderous control, Beatrice's cowardly complicity and subsequent act of self-preservation, and Ilara's decade-long lonely death. Elias, the clinical historian, felt the immense, suffocating burden of the family's secret press down on his soul. He was the only person alive who knew the truth. The murder, the confinement, the erasure. He was a man of fact, and now he held the key to a decade-old murder and a systematic act of familial cruelty. His great-aunt Ilara's final, desperate plea, transmitted through an engineered dollhouse and a silent confession, had been answered. Elias acted quickly. He had the final combination and the final physical key, which he quickly retrieved from the musty, cedar-scented trunk in the attic. An old, ornate key tucked into the pocket of a moth-eaten silk wedding dress. Undeniably, Ilara's. He returned to the basement furnace, his lamp throwing long, frantic shadows against the stone walls. He used the wedding dress key to unlock the traditional lock on the furnace door, then entered the final combination 7-12-90 into the rusted time lock on the small metal box. Clunk. The small lockbox sprang open with a sharp, final sound. Inside lay only a single, tightly rolled photograph, protected from the damp by a sheet of beeswax. Elias unrolled the picture under the flickering light of his lamp. It was a rare, clear photograph of three beautiful young women, Lillian, looking severe but elegant, Beatrice looking anxious and averted, and Ilara, standing between them, radiant, holding a book, her eyes full of life, defiance, and a terrible, promising future that was stolen from her. This was the final erasure. The destruction of the physical evidence of their life together, but preserved in a hidden box, only to be found after the truth was fully excavated. Elias then approached the massive industrial furnace. He opened the immense main door. Inside there was no ash or bone, only a small, heavy iron box secured to the grate with thick chains. This was not the repository for a body, but the actual repository of the documents. He used the thick, heavy steel rod, Lillian's tool, now Ilara's liberation instrument, to pry the box open. The metal groaned in protest. Inside he found the full, true Morton family archive, Ilara's actual valid birth certificate, all records of her engagement, the official deeds for the house, and a final signed testament by Lillian Morton, dated September the 1st, 1890, 2 weeks before her death. The house is the final ledger. My life is the account. I have secured the truth in a place that no outsider will find. Ilara is where she must be. I have sealed the house. Only the one who understands the Dollhouse diary will know the truth. The world shall see only silence, but the house will stand as a perfect testimony to my control. No one escapes. This final, arrogant testament, a chilling document of psychological planning, was what spurred Beatrice to her desperate, violent act. Lillian had sealed the house as a monument to her tyranny, believing the secret was safe in its miniature form. Elias had found the truth. The Morton house was a self-consuming tomb, a masterpiece of psychological warfare and human cruelty, hidden in plain sight. Ilara, the brilliant, defiant sister, was imprisoned and starved. Lillian, the controller, was murdered by her own victim or accomplice. And Beatrice, the terrified ghost, lived out her life alone, tormented by the secret, using the dollhouse to document the history she was too afraid to speak. Elias carefully gathered the confession, Ilara's journal, the photographs, the miniature wire doll, and the final testaments. He placed the complete archive carefully into his satchel. The burden of history was now his. He then slowly ascended the main staircase. The sun was beginning to set over the pristine, snow-covered Vermont landscape, painting the silent house in a cold, unforgiving red light. He was the last Morton. His final act was not to sell the property, but to fulfill Ilara's dying wish, to preserve the truth. He walked into the parlor and looked at the dollhouse one last time, a perfect replica of a devastating lie. He picked up the tiny Lillian doll and the tiny Beatrice doll and placed them side by side on the parlor floor, facing the wall, a final configuration of perpetual silent shame, their eyes forever averted from the truth. He then placed the crude wire doll of Ilara at the window, facing outward toward the sunrise, finally free. He did not burn the house, as Beatrice had suggested. Destruction was Lillian's final wish. Instead, he lit a small final fire in the parlor fireplace, its flickering light a brief warm vigil for the lost sisters. He walked out, locking the heavy front door behind him with the original ornate Morton key. He didn't look back as the smoke began to curl thinly from the chimney, joining the rising mist over the cold, isolated hills of Fairview. The house, its secrets finally revealed, would remain a silent monument, waiting for the auctioneer. But the truth, preserved by a historian and a historian's long-silenced great-aunt, would now finally be told. The Morton sisters were erased from the public records, but their terrifying human drama was preserved forever in the Dollhouse diary.